The tale of two Rachels, a mother and a daughter, and of course, John Donelson. The Donelsons, as you can see from the post below, were a fairly predominant family that came from Ireland, and they came through Canada and settled for a period of time in Franklin County, Virginia, and this is before the bicentennial, and they governed it there in Franklin County, Virginia, as they started their family and began their travels in 1776 with 10-year-old daughter Rachel Donelson. And as they traveled through getting to Crab Orchard, Tennessee, they found that Stockley Donelson wanted to start his family there in Crab Orchard, and he made it his home. And the Donelson family has been one of the mainstays of Crab Orchard, Tennessee ever since, thanks to Stockley. Stockley Donelson was Rachel Jackson Donelson's nephew, the First Lady to Andrew Jackson. And this nephew of hers had 4 children, Samuel, Jennifer, Thomas, and Robert. And they had their little settlement there in Crab Orchard, where they flourished for quite some time. 1835 until 1895, William Stockley Donelson lived and helped to get Crab Orchard situated, and married Alice Edwin Donelson, who lived from 1836 to 1881. John Donelson's son, John Donelson, lived from 1874 to 1852, and his wife, Betty Manise Hooper, lived from 1875 until 1963. And that's a beautiful story because my grandfather and my grandmother were there after the birth of my mother in Crab Orchard, Tennessee. And they received a letter on May the 2nd, 1944, for my mother's first birthday. And it was a family memento that my grandmother gave to me because I loved history so. And she knew that I would value it and take care of it and share it with people, because it's such a microcosm of the time. And it also helps us to understand how Rachel and Emily Donelson impacted Tennessee, as well as their father and, of course, their nephew Stockley, who founded Crab Orchard, home of Reggie White, I might add. But after Stockley got off and started to create his own little cutout in the Tennessee mountains, John Donelson went on to found what they called Fort Nashville. And as he did, Rachel, his daughter, left, and she went with Lewis Roberts and ended up in Kentucky in a marriage that didn't really last too long. They were married in 1787. She was 20 years old and fell into a situation like many of us do when we marry too young. And they decided to separate. And Lewis Roberts promised that he would divorce her, and she believed him. And then she began to have a relationship in Fort Nashville, Tennessee, with Andrew Jackson, who was a man on a mission, really. They were courting, and they became married in 1794. And they started to look at things in Tennessee differently. And of course, Andrew Jackson wasn't long until he was at war again. and he went to the Battle of New Orleans and was famous for the final victory there, and really stood up to the British in this war, bringing a campaign with him that was really sort of a microcosm of, I think, what he wanted in America, because he had Native Americans in his troops, as well as a large representation from the Tennessee Mountains, frontiersmen, soldiers, slaves, and they all sort of banded together to cut out New Orleans and make it America. And so once that happened, of course, he migrated back to Tennessee and began to build the Hermitage House for Rachel and his life. And she was, I'm sure, convinced that he would take, some political position there locally in Tennessee, and they could settle down and have a family in this beautiful Hermitage House that he had built. Unfortunately, the president called and asked him to go to what was troubling America at the time, which was the Spanish acquisition, I guess you would say, of the peninsula in Florida there, with Native Americans being part of that Spanish settlement at that time. They had a lot of renegades, people who ran away, slaves, and Native Americans. And they were also starting to see some representations from the colonists, as well as the British, who seemed to be pushing their might a little bit in the area. So the President Monroe asked Andrew Jackson, General Jackson, to go down there and sort of keep things in order in the chaos, if you will. And even mentioned to him, he said, when you get there, you might find that your calling is a little bit broader than you may think at this time. And so he went down there and faced numerous battles, and not the least of which was when the king from England had sent support for the Spanish. And of course, it rubbed Andrew Jackson the wrong way. So he arrested him and sent him to be tried with two other Brits. And the two other Brits did receive the death penalty for their efforts. And they were going to release the king's representative, if you will, who General Jackson really held accountable for selling guns and betraying what he considered to be his troops. And so he was not going to stand for it. And he told the sitting judge that he would not tolerate it. And he walked the king's man out and shot him. And the judge really didn't know what to do. And I believe General Jackson may have actually had him arrested or detained. And that's the kind of power that he brought from Tennessee with him, with his brigade, to settle Florida. And his ideal was settling it into the United States. I'm almost sure of it. He went down there with the intent of taking it from the Spanish, because he considered them to be occupying something that belonged to the South. It belonged to the United States. And he went through and from coast to coast solidified that and won the support of Native Americans, slaves, and all the other settlers there. They all were under his command. And when he got done, he became the voice Some called him the mayor, some called him the governor. But he became the voice of Florida to the president. And I think that Washington somewhat was taken back by his ability to gather such tremendous respect everywhere he went and win. And I think that they were taken back a little bit with Adams being president and running against someone like Jackson. So he formed his own party, the Democratic Party. He was the first Democrat, and he was also the first representative of Florida to Washington. So he had a lot going on while Rachel sat at the Hermitage House in Tennessee. It's a tragic story, really, because when he went back, he was elated probably with the news that they wanted him to run for president, and she wanted nothing to do with it. And when the campaigns began with Adams, they started to call her a homewrecker and a whore because it was her second marriage. And it became to a point to where she lived probably a miserable life. And the thought of leaving Hermitage, Tennessee, and going to strangers, facing this kind of obscurity, weighed on her tremendously. And finally, be it despair or whatever, her life ended. They said it almost destroyed him. A week away from going to Washington to become the president, he lost everything he had been fighting for. And so, with all the chaos that ensued, a young woman at Donelson, Emily, stepped up and said, I will perform the jobs of the First Lady under your presidency, and dedicated her life to her uncle, Andrew Jackson, in his presidency. And she served him well from 1829 until 1834. And he did a great number of things to unify the country and send our country down a vision of this Jacksonian democracy. But he was a man, and he started to develop some relationships with some females. And young Emily wasn't having anything to do with it. So when she made him accountable for these things, he was not used to being challenged. So Andrew Jackson dismissed her. And she left. And she went back to the Hermitage in Tennessee. And it wasn't long until he was asking her to come back. But as the Donelsons were, I believe it was her sister-in-law or cousin, Sarah Yorkey, served from 1834 to 1837 and finished up the jobs of the First Lady under the Jacksonian presidency. And then Andrew Jackson in 1837 went home. He enjoyed the Hermitage in Tennessee. He enjoyed being home in Tennessee. His final 8 years of his life. He did participate some in legislature. But what he did with the Hermitage and what he did in Nashville and surrounding areas, as far as developing, is unbelievable, really. When you look at the man's life, you take a look at him from the time he traveled from Virginia, where his parents had orphaned him with their deaths in the battles against the English in the Revolution. And then his, I guess we'd call it a migration or integration into the soldier that he became at 13, 14, 15, 16. And then to end up at POSTMASTER and surrounding areas and becoming a general who was responsible for winning the Battle of 1812 in New Orleans, traveling through, going to the state of Florida, settling everything in between, and taking command of the South, and fending off the British, fighting the Spanish, uh, fighting the Indians, and uh, maintaining his life, just staying alive, is unbelievable. But when you take a look at his marriage uh, and the way that he handled the White House and the presidency, uh, you can imagine how Rachel suffered. And that's all part of what a first lady's life is. And I think that we should always take a look at the special people like Michelle Obama, like Hillary Clinton, like Barbara Bush, and like Lauren Bush, and so many before, Nancy Reagan, Jackie Onassis, and all the sacrifices that they make for our country, so that these great, tremendous leaders can keep us grounded in our faith, our democracy, our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and that beautiful lady in the arbor, for which